Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and a while back, the fine folks of Arena treated us budget players to an all-access Alchemy midweek Magic event, and we celebrated that opportunity by playing a ridiculously wildcard intensive deck list for mono black that also happened to be one of the top tier decks in the meta. And since that time, I have gotten a ton of requests. I literally have lost count of doing mono black on a budget. And I'll be honest, when I first started receiving those messages, I was barely reading them because, frankly, I didn't think it was possible. That is, until recently. Before we get into all that, take just a second and smash the like button. Truly, it'll only take a moment to do all of those YouTube things, and it really helps the community. Speaking of community, if you haven't been seeing our community updates, take a moment, tap the bell icon, and update your notification settings. There's a lot of great information, and your voice can help shape the future of the channel. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Now, before we jump into the specifics of today's deck, I think it's important that we take a moment and look at the standard meta. At first glance, it looks like mono black is not king of the hill, and everything is reasonably healthy. We've got mono red with about 15%. We've got various soldier builds at another 15%. Mono black mid-range builds bringing up between 10 and 12% of the meta. And then we have Enchantress at about 6% and a mono blue control. Yes, it's a control deck, not a tempo deck. I don't know why everybody gets that confused, but it is bringing up the end of the top of the meta concern at about 5%. However, if you look at all of the black decks built around Sheldred, you get numbers as high as 40% of the meta. And that's becoming concerning. I'm not even sure that this card needs to be banned or even fixed in Alchemy, but it is definitely warping the meta around it. A card can't be in 40% of the decks and not be impacting the meta in some way. Now, with that having been said, let's take a look at the standard mono black mid-range. All right, so the mono black mid-range that we're going to be basing today's conversation is running about 7% of the meta, although there are a couple different versions, and it is actually losing ground in the meta, unlike over in Alchemy, where it was the indisputable top dog of the meta with over 15%. That mostly is because various cards that are banned in Standard are still legal in Alchemy. All in all, this deck is a pretty consistent build, running approximately 28 rares or mythics within the deck. That's right, almost a full 50% of the deck is rares and mythics. And of course, this is a monocolored deck, so none of those are really in the category of lands. So boy, have we got our work cut out for us to budget this down. Let's get going. All right, so before we dive headlong into the deck tech, let me just say this is a budget version of the deck, but it is still rather expensive. This is kind of a starting point for those of you who are looking to build this deck on a budget or something similar. And if you don't have the resources to do this version, I would recommend holding off either until you do, or maybe exploring other options within the format that better fit your collection. So with that having been said, let's take a look at the deck. I think Cut Down, everybody's familiar with this uncommon from Dominaria United. Very premium removal at 1 mana and instant speed. A Bald Sleeper, we're going to recommend running 3 copies of those. I think this is one of those creatures that's going to stick around in black for quite some time. So even if you do expend some wild cards on this, I think it's going to be a good investment. But by only having 3, that still gives you the option to potentially open one later in the season and pick up that 4th without expending wild cards for it. March of Wretched Sorrows, this is basically a removal spell that came to you in your new player experience. I know everyone has at least 1 copy, and many of you who joined after rotation are going to see 2 of these free in your new player experience. Thus, we are running 2. Fake Your Own Death is a basic save your creature spell. Came to you in your new player experience. 2 copies should be no problem at all. Go for the Throat, another premium removal, 2 mana instant from Brothers War. If you don't have these yet, I imagine you will have them shortly. Infernal Grasp was part of your new player experience. I'm recommending 3 copies here. This overall gives you 9 pieces of removal. Which is enough to frustrate your opponents and maybe get a little scoopage out of there. Misery Shadow is one of the rares from Brothers War that is very quickly making a name for itself in mono black. I'm not sure how well this one is going to stand the test of time, but I think if you don't already have a copy, it is probably worth considering a wild card on this to at least experiment with it, and for nothing else, you'll have it for brawl purposes later on, even if it does kind of drop out of the meta versions of the deck. Tenacious Underdog, this is last year's mono black beater. You got it in your new player experience, so I know you have at least 1, and again, depending upon your timing, you may have 2. Absolutely awesome spell. Right now, I would say give a lot of thought to crafting more of these, because these are going to rotate in the fall, and a lot of versions of the deck are not running the full 4 at this point anyway. So definitely give that some thought. Reckoner Bankbuster is in mono black, it's in mono white, it's in several builds, usually in quantities of 2 or 3. So this is one of those cards, if you don't already have it, it may be worth considering for a craft. At the very least, 1 copy, I think, of this card is going to see play for years in various brawl builds and things like that, and 2 for standard with 6 months before rotation may not be the worst idea ever. Another one of last year's mono black beaters that kind of took a while for people to catch on to is Graveyard Trespasser. Mostly at a 3/3 for 3, it's fair. It has good value, but what really pushes this over the top is the ward on this. Forcing your opponent to discard a card to target it basically means if they remove it, they've 2 for 1 themselves. And, oh yeah, by the way, if it becomes nighttime, it becomes a 4/4 with the same ward ability. Just absolutely crazy. And it has some ETB and attack triggers that allow you to mess with your opponent's graveyard or potentially even your own, and force your opponent to lose some life and you potentially gain some life on that as well. Just adding a little gravy to the plate of the meat that is Graveyard Trespasser. A newer card that is seeing a lot of early play and really holds a lot of promise, Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. Legendary creature, 3/3 for 3, and it's a card draw engine on top of everything else. Pretty wild. I think this has really only got a lot of upside. It's available to you through Jump In if you happen to get it as a mythic upgrade. I'm not sure I would spend wildcards on it just yet. I would probably wait until we see what's going on with the next set, but a very solid card early on. Similarly, Liliana of the Veil from Dominaria United. This is just a solid 3-mana Planeswalker. sees a lot of play and is also available to you again through that jump-in mythic upgrade option. Many of you are going to have a copy of this already, and if you don't, you've got almost 2 years before this card rotates, and it's pretty solid, just saying. Of course, everyone who's thinking about Mono Black is familiar with Sheldred, the Apocalypse, the legendary 4/5 Death Touch for 4 that forces your opponent to lose life every time they draw a card and you to gain life every time you draw a card. While this was definitely a 4 of in many versions of the deck early on, it has already dropped to a 3 of. And I think if you don't already own copies on this, I wouldn't spend more than 2 wildcards here. There's just a lot that could happen that maybe pushes this out. Don't know yet. All in all, though, I do think it's a good card. I think if you don't own any, consider 2 wildcards for it. It's pretty solid. And I don't think you're going to regret it, but the meta is a fickle bitch. From there, we got Gix's Command. This is just a really strong multi-phase, I'm going to stick with phase. Multi-phase utility spell. It is sorcery speed. It is 5 mana. But I feel more comfortable recommending 1 copy of this and 2 copies of Invoke Despair, because Gix's Command has about a year and a half before it's going to rotate. Invoke Despair, you're under 6 months. Both are really great cards and probably equally as strong in the format right now, although they do kind of have different effects. From there, we've got some budget fillers. The Goring Warplow, a 1/1 prototype Death Touch for 2 mana, or late game 6 mana 5/4 Death Touch. Either version is really, really solid, but as you're playing the deck, I think more often than not, you're going to drop this as a 2-drop and use that to hold the battlefield so that you can get down your 3 and 4 drops and take control. For late game budget options, I'm including 2 copies of Corrupt. This allows you to either target your opponent or one of their creatures, or even a planeswalker for damage equal to the number of swamps you control. It's 6 mana, and oh yeah, by the way, however much damage that deals, you gain that much life. So it's a nice, easy way to stabilize in the late game and pull out those last couple turns you need for Sheldred to do his business. Phyrexian Fleshgorger is the other big bomb. It's another prototype 7 for a 7/5 menace lifelink ward. Pay life equal to Phyrexian Fleshgorger's power. The prototype option is 3 mana for a 3/3. Either is really, really good, but this is a mythic, and while it's super nice, I don't know that I'd spend a wild card on this. I have a feeling this is going to age out of the deck long before it rotates. If you've got it, definitely run it. I don't think you'll regret it, but you may come to regret spending a wild card on this if you don't have one already. But if you're following the plan, I'd say you're about 50% likely to have one of these already. Now, with all of this having been looked at, before we go, let's talk about the mana base. Obviously, it is mostly swamps. I'm also running 2 copies of Evolving Wilds just for deck fitting purposes. And I know everyone has Evolving Wilds from the new player experience. You could easily drop both of these, add a swamp, and add any of these cards that you happen to have more copies of. With possible exception of Corrupt, I don't know that I'd go a 3rd copy of Corrupt. But that is certainly an option. And all of that having been said, this again is a starting point for the deck. There is no reason to limit yourself to the quantities here for the most part. If you have 3-4 copies of Sheldred, if you have more copies of Liliana, Underdog, Evolved Sleeper, Graveyard Trespasser, Invoke Despair, Gix, Fleshgorger, any of these that you have more of, I would certainly feel comfortable in advising you to play with the individual counts on the deck and get the more powerful cards in there. if you already own them. Again, this is meant to be a starting point, so if you're thinking about building this deck on a budget, this is kind of your entry level. So now the question remains, how did we do? And I have to say, I feel like this deck does pretty well. We got the rare mythic count down to 20, 4 of which are available to you in your new player experience with 0 wildcard outlay, and 2 more can easily be acquired with a little bit of luck through the jump-in events, bringing the potential wildcard count down to 14 expected wildcards here. And folks, that's a 50% reduction over the original deck list for this Tier 1 meta list. In testing various versions of this deck, I was getting win rates of between 62 and 65%. Unfortunately, my sample sizes aren't nearly as large as those that Aetherhub are running, but all in all, this deck was nearly as successful as its larger, more expensive brother. And a lot of that actually came down to the fact that people very often were scooping to my deck without ever playing long enough to realize that they were playing a slightly underpowered version on a budget. And frankly, I'll take those wins. The fully powered expensive version is running about a 69% win rate. And really going even as low as 63% on a budget version versus 69% on a fully powered is pretty darn good. Another way of looking at this is you can get 90% or more of the performance out of this deck at half the overall cost. And folks, I'll take that any day. And folks, before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on a thing. Because I know I can't change the Magic economy all by myself, but I think we can.